A single hastily scrawled note lay on the oak table, its edges curling from the damp of an untended hall. Gina stood frozen, her hand resting on the sudden terrifying swell of her stomach. He was gone. 3 years of freezing winters, rotting floorboards, and a bankrupt title followed. When the Duke finally returned expecting a weeping ghost, he found a fortress. She didn't need a savior. He had to earn the right to call it home. The note smelled faintly of bay rum and cowardice. Gina held the heavy parchment between her thumb and forefinger, feeling the coarse grain of the paper. She didn't weep. The tears felt trapped somewhere behind her breastbone, blocked by a rising, suffocating tide of bile. Ainsley had written exactly 4 sentences. Duty, the crown, the war in the East, a promise to return when the continent was stabilized. He hadn't mentioned the child. He hadn't mentioned that there was barely enough coal in the cellars to last through November. She dropped the letter onto the dining table. The wood was scarred ancient oak that had seen generations of Steve's feast and rot. Right now, it held nothing but the letter and a single sputtering tallow candle that smelled of rancid mutton fat. Gina wrapped her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was a fine cashmere weave, a wedding gift from an aunt who hadn't realized the Duke of Westford's wealth was entirely tied up in unyielding clay soil and crumbling masonry. The shawl did nothing to stop the creeping wet cold of the Abbey from seeping into her bones. Your Grace, the voice was a dry rasp. Terence Ross, the estate steward, stood in the arched doorway. He was a man made entirely of sharp angles and graying hair, clutching a leather-bound ledger as if it were a shield. His cuffs were frayed. He rode out before dawn, Ross, Gina said. Her voice sounded strange in the cavernous room. Flat. Hollow. I am aware, Your Grace. I heard the horses. Ross didn't offer pity. He offered the ledger. He stepped forward, his boot heels clicking unevenly against the uneven flagstones. The baker in the village is refusing further credit. The south roof over the servants' quarters is sagging, and the cook threatens to leave if she isn't paid her back wages from the old Duke's time. Gina looked at the old man. She was 19. She had been a bride for 4 months. She was supposed to be learning how to host garden parties and arrange dried hydrangeas, not managing a bankrupt, decaying fortress, while her husband played soldier to escape the claustrophobia of his own failures. Her stomach churned. A wave of morning sickness hit her, metallic and sharp tasting of the thin porridge she'd forced down earlier. She gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white. She breathed in through her nose. The smell of dust-wet stone and decaying rushes on the floor filled her lungs. Let the cook go, Gina said. The words tasted like ash, but they were steady. Ross blinked. Your Grace, who will prepare the meals? She serves us boiled gristle and steals the good wine. I've seen her doing it. Gina pushed herself off the table. The sudden movement made the room tilt, but she forced her spine straight. Promote the scullery maid. Pay the cook whatever silver is left in the drawing-room strongbox and tell her to walk. If she refuses, tell her I will have the magistrate look into the missing Bordeaux. And the roof? Ross asked, a flicker of something, perhaps surprise, warming his milky eyes. We moved the servants to the east wing, shut the south wing down entirely, locked the doors, let it rot until we have the coin to fix it. She reached out and snatched the ledger from his hands. It was heavy smelling of old leather and ink. Show me the debts. All of them. Not just the ones you think my delicate constitution can handle. Ross hesitated, then opened the book. The pages were a mess of red ink. Debts to the blacksmith, the farrier, the tailor in London, the apothecaries. Ainsley had inherited a hollow shell of a dukedom. He had married her for her dowry, and when that had vanished into the gaping maw of his creditors, he had fled. Gina ran a finger over the red lines. The skin of her index finger caught on the rough paper. She looked up at the tapestries hanging on the far wall. They depicted a triumphant hunt-hounds tearing at the throat of a stag. The heavy fabric was thick with dust and moth holes sagging under its own weight. Take those down, she murmured. The tapestries they have hung there since. They are heavy velvet and wool Ross. Take them down. We will cut them up and use them to draft-proof the windows in the inhabited rooms. Then send for the timber merchant. We are selling the mahogany dining chairs. It wasn't a sudden heroic transformation. It was the desperate, ugly pragmatism of a cornered animal. Over the next 3 months, Gina stripped the abbey of its pretenses. The grand halls were locked. The ornate, useless silver centerpieces were sent to London and melted down. The cold was relentless. Winter descended on the valley like a hammer blow. Ice crusted the inside of the windows. Gina abandoned her corsets entirely, swapping her silk gowns for heavy men's riding trousers and thick woolen sweaters she knitted herself by the hearth fire. Her fingernails, once buffed with rose oil, chipped and filled with the ever-present soot of the fireplaces. The child grew heavy in her belly, an anchor tying her to the crumbling stones. She hated Ainsley. It wasn't a hot, fiery hatred. It was cold. It was the temperature of the draft under the door. She hated him when she had to step over a rat trap in the kitchen. She hated him when the wind howled through the chimneys, sounding like a dying beast. But beneath the hatred, a strange feral possession took root. Ainsley had abandoned the abbey. That meant it was hers. Every leak she patched, every debt she paid off by selling another piece of his ancestral vanity, made the stones belong to her. The first contraction hit her in the mud. It was late February. A false spring had turned the courtyard into a treacherous swamp of freezing brown muck. Gina was standing ankle-deep in it, a heavy, oiled canvas cloak thrown over her enormous stomach. She was pointing a mud-caked finger at a wagon full of slate. "I said 50 square feet, Miller. This is barely 40 and half the tiles are cracked." She snapped, her breath pluming in the frigid air. The stone merchant shifted nervously, his eyes darting from her fierce glare to the ruined boots she wore. "The roads, your grace. The frost heaves broke 'em. I can't help the weather." "I am not paying full price for half a load of rubble." The pain started low in her back, a dull, heavy ache that suddenly sharpened into an iron band tightening around her spine. She stopped mid-sentence. Her breath caught. The smell of the wet earth, the raw scent of the draft horses, the damp wool of her cloak, everything sharpened into terrifying clarity. She didn't gasp. She clamped her jaw shut. The contraction peaked, holding her in a vice of agonizing pressure, then slowly released. "Unload what is whole." Gina managed to say, her voice tight. "Ross will pay you for 30 feet. She turned and walked toward the heavy oak doors. Every step was a calculation. By the time she reached the great hall, the second contraction hit. She grabbed the edge of a heavy iron candelabra, leaning her weight onto it as her knuckles turned white. There was no soft bedding, no hushed glowing room filled with supportive women. Ross found her leaning against the wall, her face pale and sweating despite the cold. He ran for the village midwife. The labor lasted 14 hours. Gina lay on a narrow bed in the steward's quarters. It was the warmest room in the house, closer to the kitchens. The air smelled thick, copper sweat and the sharp burning tang of the lye soap the midwife had used to scrub her thick, calloused hands. "Push, your grace. Push through the burn." The midwife grunted. She was a broad-shouldered woman who smelled of onions and stale pipe smoke. Gina screamed. It wasn't a polite, delicate sound. It was an animal noise torn from the very bottom of her throat. She bit down on a rolled-up piece of clean linen until she tasted her own blood. Her body felt like it was being torn in half. There was no romance in this. There was only pain sweat stinging her eyes and the terrifying, overwhelming pressure. Again, she pushed until black spots danced in her vision, until the roaring in her ears drowned out the howling wind outside, and then a sudden wet relief. A sharp, furious cry pierced the heavy air of the room. Gina collapsed back onto the sweat-soaked pillows, her chest heaving. The midwife wiped the infant down with a rough cloth. "A girl, your grace. Strong lungs on her." They placed the bundle on Gina's chest. The baby was red-wrinkled and covered in a milky substance. She smelled metallic and warm. Gina touched the tiny flailing fist with a trembling, soot-stained finger. "Clara." Gina whispered, her throat raw. She looked down at the child. The crushing weight of responsibility she had felt for the abbey suddenly magnified 1,000 times. She wasn't just fixing a roof anymore. She was building a fortress for this tiny, fragile creature. By the time Clara was walking, the abbey was unrecognizable. Gina had leased the eastern grazing fields to a local sheep farmer, demanding payment in both coin and wool. The spinning wheels clacked incessantly in the great hall, which now smelled of lanolin hot wax and roasting root vegetables. The floors had been scrubbed and patched with raw pine. It wasn't elegant, it clashed horribly with the Gothic stonework, but it was solid. Gina herself had hardened. The soft, frightened bride was dead. In her place was a woman with permanent ink stains on her fingers from managing the ledgers, a sharp tongue that terrified the local merchants, and a deep abiding pragmatism. She held Clara on her hip while she negotiated grain prices. She bounced the toddler while pointing out rotten floor joists to the carpenters. The abbey didn't hum with aristocratic leisure. It buzzed with frantic, necessary industry. When a letter occasionally arrived from the continent bearing the Duke's seal, Gina didn't open it. She tossed it onto the kitchen hearth, watching the wax bubble and melt the parchment turning black and curling into ash. "You should read them," Ross murmured one evening, watching a letter burn. The old man had developed a deep grudging respect for her, though he still clung to the ghost of his master's authority. "What?" Gina asked, rocking a sleepy Clara in her lap. "Will the words inside fix the water pump in the courtyard? Will they pay for Clara's winter boots?" "He is still your husband." Gina looked at the fire. "No, Ross. He is a legal technicality. This house runs on sweat, not titles." Ainsley Steeves expected to find ruins. As he rode up the winding, muddy road toward Westford Abbey, the rain soaking through his heavy cavalry coat, he braced himself for the guilt. He had been gone 3 years. 3 years of blood dysentery and the chaotic noise of artillery fire. He was coming back with a noticeable limp, 2 missing fingers on his left hand from a grape-shot blast, and a soul entirely hollowed out by the things he had seen. He expected the gates to be rusted shut. He expected the roof to be caved in. He expected Gina, if she hadn't fled back to her family, to be a weeping, starved ghost ready to throw her despair at his feet. He rode his exhausted gelding into the courtyard and stopped. He blinked rainwater dripping from the brim of his hat. The courtyard was paved. Fresh gravel crunched under his horse's hooves. The stables, which had been leaning precariously when he left, were braced with heavy raw timber and freshly thatched. A stable boy, a lad of about 14 in clean-mended wool, ran out to take the reins. Ainsley dismounted his bad leg, sending a jolt of sharp pain up his thigh. "Who are you?" he rasped. His voice was gravelly from disuse and cold. "Liam, sir," the boy said, taking the horse without a second glance at the mud-caked, scarred soldier. "Stable hand. You here to sell grain? You'll have to go round the back to the kitchen door." Ainsley stared at the boy. The sheer, profound alienation hit him like a physical blow. He was a stranger in his own courtyard. He didn't correct the boy. He turned and walked toward the main doors. The heavy iron hinges didn't scream when he pushed them. They glided smoothly, smelling faintly of rendered grease. He stepped into the great hall. The air hit him first. It was warm, profoundly, deeply warm. The massive fireplaces at either end of the hall, which used to smoke terribly and freeze the room, were drawing perfectly filled with roaring logs. The air smelled of roasting meat, rosemary, dried lavender, and beeswax. The grand tapestries were gone. In their place, the stone walls had been scrubbed clean. The delicate, rotting velvet chairs had been replaced by heavy utilitarian oak benches and tables, and at the center table, surrounded by ledgers, sat his wife. Ainsley stopped in the shadows of the doorway. He hardly recognized her. Gina wasn't wearing silk. She wore a dark gray woolen gown, simple and practical, the sleeves rolled up to her elbows. Her hair, once curled perfectly, was braided back tightly. She looked older, sharper. There was a smudge of black ink on her cheek. As he watched a small child, a girl with a messy tangle of dark hair, ran across the floorboards holding a wooden toy horse. She crashed into Gina's knees. Gina didn't scold the child. She smoothly scooped the girl up with one arm balancing her on her hip, while she continued to read a parchment, her eyes scanning the lines rapidly. Ainsley's breath hitched. A daughter. His daughter. A dull ache bloomed in his chest. He felt dirty. He smelled of wet horse-stale sweat and old blood. He belonged to the mud of the battlefield, not to this clean, brightly lit, functional space. He took a step forward. His boot heel struck the floorboards loudly. Gina looked up. There was no dramatic gasp, no dropping of the ledger. She just stared at him, her eyes clear and cold as winter streams tracked over his ruined coat, his unshaven face the missing fingers on his left hand where it rested on his sword hilt. The silence stretched thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackle of the fire and the soft babble of the child in her arms. Ainsley opened his mouth. He had prepared a dozen speeches on the ride back. Apologies, explanations of duty, pleas for forgiveness. But looking at her, looking at the calluses on her hands, and the absolute lack of need in her posture, every single word evaporated. She didn't need a savior. She had saved herself. "You're alive," she stated. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an exclamation of joy. It was a simple factual observation. "I am..." Ainsley rasped his voice, sounding pitifully small in the vast hall. He swallowed hard. "Gina, She cut him off. She didn't raise her voice, but the steel in it commanded the room. "Take your muddy boots off the rug," Gina said flatly, pointing a pen at his feet. "I traded 3 tons of winter wheat to the weavers for it, and I will not have you ruin it in your first 5 minutes. Ainsley looked down at the vibrant, thick wool rug beneath his dripping boots. He looked back at his wife. The sheer absurd domesticity of the demand stripped away whatever noble tragic return he had envisioned. Slowly, awkwardly, his face burning with a flush of intense shame and a strange, overwhelming relief, the Duke of Westford bent down struggling with his stiff leg and pulled his boots off. He stood in his damp socks holding the muddy leather. He looked at Gina. She was already looking back down at her ledger, though he could see a tight muscle jumping in her jaw. "Welcome back to Westford," she said without looking up. "Leave the boots by the door. Dinner is in an hour. We eat in the kitchen now." Ainsley placed his boots on the stone floor. He was a trespasser here. A ghost who had returned to find out the living had moved on entirely without him. But as he breathed in the smell of the roasting meat and the wood smoke, a single undeniable thought cut through his shame. He was finally home, and he was going to have to earn the right to stay. Porcelain scraped against the scarred pine of the kitchen table. Ainsley sat perfectly still, listening to the agonizingly loud sound of his own breathing. The kitchen was a cavernous space of stone and iron, utterly devoid of the delicate plastered ceilings and silk wall coverings of the formal dining rooms. It smelled fiercely of rendered mutton fat, sharp yellow onions, and the harsh lye soap used to scrub the flagstones. Heat radiated from the massive open hearth, pressing against Ainsley's face and making the old scars on his neck itch. He stared at his bowl. It was thick, cheap clay filled with a dense root vegetable stew. Chunks of coarse bread sat on a wooden trencher in the center of the table. Gina sat opposite him. She hadn't changed for dinner. She still wore the heavy gray wool, her sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms that were lean and corded with tight, functional muscle. She was cutting a piece of roasted carrot into minuscule pieces for the toddler sitting on a raised wooden stool beside her. Clara. Ainsley couldn't pull his eyes away from the girl. She had his dark, curling hair, but her eyes were entirely Gina's wide, calculating, and the color of a stormy winter sky. Clara stared back at him around a mouthful of mashed carrot. She didn't smile. She watched him with the wary curiosity of a feral barn cat encountering a strange, injured dog. He reached for his spoon. His right hand gripped the handle easily, but as he reached across for a piece of bread with his left, the movement snagged. The space where his ring and pinky fingers used to be felt suddenly humiliatingly obvious. The ragged flesh healed into thick, shiny keloid scars, caught the yellow light of the tallow candles. Gina's eyes flicked to his hand. Ainsley froze. He braced himself for the gasp, the pitying look, the frantic questions about the war, and the grape shot that had mangled him. She paused the paring knife hovering over a parsnip. Her gaze lingered on the mutilated skin for exactly 2 seconds. A muscle feathered in her jaw. Then smoothly, deliberately, she looked back down at her daughter's plate and resumed cutting. "Pass the salt, Ross," Gina said. Ross, sitting at the far end of the table, silently slid a small wooden pinch bowl across the pine boards. The steward didn't look at Ainsley either. The hierarchy of the table was glaringly apparent. The Duke of Westford sat in the middle, ignored. The steward and the Duchess operated as a synchronized, efficient unit. Ainsley pulled his left hand back and dropped it into his lap, hiding it beneath the coarse linen napkin. Shame, hot and acidic, burned the back of his throat. "She has grown!" Ainsley rasped. His voice sounded like cracked dry leather. Gina didn't look up. Children tend to do that when they are fed. The words weren't delivered with venom. They were flat, carrying the devastating weight of a simple fact. Ainsley flinched. Gina, He stopped. What could he say? I bled for the crown. I lay in a ditch in Flanders with dysentery for 3 weeks praying for death. None of it mattered here. The war was an abstract concept. The winter draft rattling the kitchen windows was the immediate enemy. Who, man? Clara suddenly chirped, pointing a small sticky finger directly at Ainsley's face. Ainsley's heart hammered against his ribs. He leaned forward slightly, a desperate hollow ache opening up in his chest. I am your father, he wanted to say. I am the Duke. Gina scooped a spoonful of stew into the child's mouth, neatly catching a drip with the edge of her thumb. Eat your supper, Clara. Who, man? The toddler insisted, kicking her small leather boots against the legs of her high stool. He is a guest, Gina said softly. The word hit Ainsley harder than the grape shot ever had. A guest. He looked at the walls of his ancestral home. He looked at the wife he had wed in a cathedral with 300 lords and ladies in attendance. He looked at the daughter he had never held. A guest. He looked down at his stew. It tasted like sawdust and salt, but he forced himself to swallow it. He needed the strength. I intend to review the estate ledgers tomorrow morning, Ainsley said. He tried to inject a note of authority into his voice, pulling his spine straight, despite the screaming protest of his injured thigh. I need to understand the current financial standing of Westford. Ross paused his spoon halfway to his mouth. He looked at Gina seeking permission before he even acknowledged his lord's command. Gina finally met Ainsley's gaze. The candlelight caught the exhaustion in her eyes, the dark bruised circles beneath her lower lashes, the fine lines of strain framing her mouth. She didn't look like a girl of 22. She looked like a veteran of a much longer, quieter war. The ledgers are in the steward's office, she said quietly, though I doubt you will find the mathematics familiar. We do not deal in thousands of pounds anymore, Ainsley. We deal in bushels of rye and cords of firewood. If you wish to read them, you may, but do not interrupt Ross's morning tallies. He has real work to do. She wiped Clara's chin with a cloth, lifted the child from the stool, and stood. The heavy wool of her skirt brushed against the table leg. Leave your dishes by the basin, she instructed him, her tone identical to the one she used to dismiss the stable boy. Your old chambers in the West Wing are sealed. The roof leaked and the floorboards rotted through 2 winters ago. Ross has prepared the small guest room off the secondary landing for you. Good night. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, Clara resting comfortably on her hip. Ainsley sat alone in the massive room, the fire popping in the hearth. He looked at his ruined left hand resting on his thigh. He had survived the French cavalry. He wasn't entirely sure he was going to survive his wife. Morning frost clung to the narrow window panes like ground glass. Ainsley woke with a gasp, his shattered thigh bone cramping violently in the damp cold. Refusing to call for help, he spent 20 agonizing minutes managing the small horn buttons of his trousers with numb, clumsy fingers. He would not be a burden in a house that had already learned to survive without him. Leaning heavily on his ash walking stick, he dragged his bad leg down the corridor. His boots clacked unevenly against the bare floorboards. Step drag. Step drag. He found Ross in the cramped windowless steward's office, the air thick with ink, old paper, and beeswax. The Duchess mentioned the ledgers, Ainsley said, sinking heavily into a wooden chair opposite the desk. He leaned his cane against the wall. Show them to me. Ross hesitated before pulling 3 rough-cut stained books from a drawer. They were far from the elegant gold-leafed volumes Ainsley's father had kept. The covers were water-stained and smeared with what looked like sheep's blood. Ainsley opened the first book, bracing for a chaotic tally of mounting debts. Instead, he found brutal, unforgiving poetry. Gina's handwriting was fast and aggressively precise. Page after page detailed the complete dismantling of his heritage. She had sold the silver, the mahogany, and leased the hunting grounds for roof slates and winter grain. His eyes snagged on an entry from 3 years ago. Item 2, formal dining chandeliers, crystal, exchanged. Debt cleared with the farrier. Remainder traded for 40 yards of coarse wool. An irrational flash of anger hit him. She sold the crystal for wool, but it quickly crumbled into deep, humiliating awe. He tracked the harsh winters in the margins. He saw months where she skipped buying coal to pay a mason to reinforce the foundation, and times they survived entirely on salted pork and root vegetables to buy spring seed. She hadn't just survived. She had carved the gangrenous rot out of his estate with a rusty knife and forced it to walk again. There are no outstanding debts. Your Grace, Ross said quietly, watching Ainsley's face pale. The Duchess paid the last of your father's creditors 6 months ago. We operate strictly on trade and cash surplus now. Ainsley closed the heavy ledger. It felt like a tombstone. She sold everything. She saved the stone, sir, Ross corrected gently, but with an unmistakable edge of steel. You have a home to return to because she was willing to freeze to ensure it stood. Ainsley swallowed hard, the silence pressing against his eardrums. He grabbed his cane and stood his legs, screaming in protest. Where is she? In the lower courtyard. The sheep shearers have arrived from the village. Ainsley navigated the biting cold of the corridors and pushed open the heavy side door. The lower courtyard was pure chaos. Over 100 thick-coated sheep milled in wooden pens, the air pungent with the greasy smell of lanolin and animal waste. 4 rough men were hauling the protesting animals onto platforms, their heavy iron shears snapping rhythmically in the freezing air. In the center stood Gina, wearing heavy leather gloves and a mud-smeared canvas coat. She was arguing fiercely with a massive bearded man holding a pair of shears. I told you, Miller, I am not paying by the head if the fleeces are hacked to pieces. Her voice cut through the bleeding, sharp and commanding. You ruined 3 pelts yesterday. If I see blood on another sheep, I will dock your pay by a shilling. The shearer scowled, stepping aggressively toward her. He towered over Gina. I've been shearing before you were born Duchess. You don't know the blade. I know the price of ruined wool in London. She snapped back, stepping into his space entirely unafraid. Ainsley's military instincts flared. A man was threatening his wife. Adrenaline, cold and sharp, flooded his veins, overriding the pain in his leg. He tightened his grip on his heavy ash cane and moved forward, his boots crunching violently against the frosty gravel. Back away from her, Ainsley barked, his voice carrying the deep, authoritative rumble of a cavalry officer issuing an order under fire. He planted his weight between Gina and the shearer, bringing his cane up slightly. He glared at the large man with a homicidal stillness that made the shearer take a hesitant step back. Ainsley felt a brief, fierce surge of pride. He was protecting her. Ainsley! Gina's voice was right behind him. It wasn't relieved. It was incredibly, terrifyingly tired. Step aside, she said. Ainsley turned, confusion breaking his aggressive stance. He was disrespecting you. I'm simply... You are interrupting my negotiation. Gina interrupted, her eyes flashing with a cold, pale fire. She stepped around him, entirely dismissing his protective barrier, and looked directly at the shearer. Well, Miller, do we have an agreement, or do I hire the men from Oakhaven tomorrow? The shearer grumbled, looking at his boots. Aye, Your Grace. Clean cuts. No blood. Good. Get back to work. She turned toward the stables. Ainsley stood frozen in the muck sheep milling around his legs as the adrenaline crashed, leaving him feeling sick and foolish. He hobbled after her, his bad leg dragging heavily. Gina, wait, he called out, catching her arm with his good hand near the stable doors. She stopped and stared pointedly at his hand gripping her coat. Her expression was unreadable. Ainsley let go, immediately stepping back. I was trying to help, he defended weakly. You are the Duchess of Westford. You shouldn't have to bicker with common laborers in the mud. Gina let out a harsh sound that might have been a laugh if it held any humor. She slowly pulled off one of her thick leather gloves. Her hand was red from the cold, the knuckles raw, the fingernails blunt and chipped. She held her bare hand up between them. Look at my hands, Ainsley, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce, ragged whisper. Look at them. Do they look like the hands of a woman who needs a knight to save her from a rude conversation? Ainsley stared at her roughened skin, unable to speak. You left me in an empty, freezing tomb. She continued stepping closer, the smell of lanolin radiating off her. I learned how to argue in the mud because if I didn't, we would have starved. I don't need a protector. I needed a partner. 3 years ago. She pulled the heavy glove back on her movements, sharp and precise. Do not ever step in front of me again, Ainsley, she said quietly. In this valley, my word is the only law that kept the roof over our heads. If you undermine me in front of the tenants, you will destroy the only thing of value left in this dukedom. She turned and walked into the dim warmth of the stables, leaving the Duke of Westford standing entirely alone in the cold. It had been 4 days since the incident with the sheep shearer, 4 days of Ainsley actively forcing himself to become invisible in his own home. He stopped sitting at the center of the kitchen table, moving his bowl to the far corner near the drafty pantry door. He stopped asking Ross for the ledgers. Instead, he watched. He watched the relentless, exhausting machinery of the Abbey, the hauling of water, the scrubbing of stones, the endless mending of wool. And he realized that every ounce of bread he consumed was an ounce Gina had fought the earth to provide. So he found the woodpile. Ainsley reached into the pocket of his heavy coat and pulled out a length of oiled leather strapping a rein he had cut from the stables. He wrapped it tightly around the hickory handle, then bound it over the back of his mangled left hand, strapping his remaining fingers securely to the wood. He couldn't grip, but he could anchor. He lifted the maul again, forcing his weight onto his good leg, and brought the iron down. Crack. The oak split into 2 perfect halves. You are going to ruin your coat, your grace. Ainsley paused the maul, resting on the chopping block. Ross stood in the archway of the courtyard holding a basket of root vegetables. The steward's face was a mask of strained politeness, but his eyes tracked the leather strap binding Ainsley's hand to the tool. The coat is already ruined, Terence. Ainsley said, his voice raspy. He unspooled the leather and tossed another log onto the block. And the kitchen's burned through a cord of wood a week in this weather. The stable boy is too slight to swing this maul effectively. I am not. It is not fitting work for a duke. I haven't been a duke in 3 years. I was a captain of infantry, and before that I was a coward. Ainsley didn't look at the older man. He swung the maul. Crack. If I cannot balance the ledgers, I can at least ensure my wife doesn't freeze while she does. He kept chopping. He chopped until the blisters on his right hand burst and bled into his gloves. He chopped until his bad leg gave out entirely, forcing him to drop to his knees in the sawdust, and Frost panting, surrounded by a mountain of split oak. A small sound broke the silence. Ainsley looked up, wiping his forehead with the back of his wrist. Clara was standing 10 feet away, bundled in so much gray wool she looked like a small walking sheep. She clutched her battered wooden horse to her chest. She was staring at him, her wide storm gray eyes fixed on the leather strap hanging from his mutilated hand. Ainsley froze. He didn't want to frighten her. He slowly reached down and unbuckled the strap hiding his left hand behind his knee. Clara didn't run. She took a step forward, her tiny leather boots crunching on the wood chips. She stopped at the edge of the pile of freshly split wood. She crouched down, her movements clumsy in the thick wool, and picked up a small, smooth wedge of pale oak that had splintered off a larger log. She walked over to him and held it out. Ainsley stared at the piece of wood, then at his daughter. His throat tightened, a thick, choking knot rising under his collar. He reached out with his good hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and took the wood from her small, mitten-clad hand. "Thank you," he whispered. Clara pointed a chubby finger at his left hand, the one hidden behind his leg. "Hurt?" she asked. Her voice was tiny, a soft bell in the freezing air. Ainsley swallowed hard. He slowly brought his left hand forward, resting it on his thigh. The shiny, jagged scars stood out starkly against the dark fabric of his trousers. "Yes," Ainsley said honestly. "It hurt very badly. But it is better now. Just clumsy." Clara stared at the missing fingers for a long time. She didn't flinch. She reached out and lightly tapped the deepest scar with her index finger, a purely clinical toddler investigation. Then, seemingly satisfied that he wasn't going to break, she thrust her wooden toy horse into his face. "Leg broke," she demanded. Ainsley took the toy. It was a crude thing, and indeed one of the back legs had snapped off. He looked at the smooth wedge of oak she had just handed him. He looked up at the child. I can fix it, Ainsley said, if you sit quietly. He pulled a small clasp knife from his pocket. For the next hour, he sat in the sawdust, ignoring the agonizing cramp in his thigh, and slowly whittled a new leg for the horse. It was an awkward, difficult process. He had to pin the horse against his chest with his left forearm while he carved with his right. The new leg was slightly thicker than the others, and he couldn't smooth it perfectly, but he managed to wedge it into the joint. He set the horse down on the chopping block. It stood unevenly, leaning slightly to the left, but it stood. Clara grabbed it, inspecting the lopsided repair. A massive, brilliant smile broke across her face, the first smile Ainsley had ever seen from her. It hit him like a physical blow to the ribs. Broken horse, she announced happily, trotting it across the frost-covered chopping block. Yes, Ainsley murmured, watching her. A broken horse, but it still runs. Up in the narrow window of the steward's office, Gina stood in the shadows, her hand pressed against the cold glass. She had watched the entire exchange. She watched the proud, arrogant man she had married sitting in the dirt, bleeding into his gloves, carefully carving a toy for a child he didn't know. She turned away from the window, her chest tight with a confusing, heavy ache. The ledger on her desk suddenly looked very blurry. She pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes, refusing to let the tears fall. The cough sounded like tearing parchment. It started just after midnight, a dry, rattling hack that echoed down the dark stone corridors of the East Wing. Gina woke instantly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She threw off her heavy quilts, the freezing air of her bedchamber biting into her skin through her linen shift. She ran barefoot across the hall to Clara's small room. The child was thrashing violently in her narrow bed. Gina touched Clara's forehead and yanked her hand back. The girl's skin was radiating heat, burning with a fierce, sudden fever. Clara's eyes were half open, glassy, and unseeing, and her breathing came in shallow, rapid gasps. No, 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 Gina chanted, a raw, primal terror seizing her throat. This was the enemy she couldn't outsmart. She couldn't trade wool to cure a fever. She couldn't patch a lung with raw pine. Ross... Gina screamed, her voice cracking in the darkness. Ross, bring water. She dragged every heavy woolen blanket off the spare bed and piled them onto Clara, trying to sweat the fever out, relying on the panicked instincts of a mother who had never relied on a doctor. Footsteps pounded down the corridor, but it wasn't the slow, uneven click of the steward's boots. It was the heavy, dragging run of Ainsley. He burst into the room wearing only his trousers and a loose shirt, his hair wild, leaning heavily on his ash cane. He took one look at Gina, frantically piling blankets onto the thrashing child, and the air in the room shifted. The hesitant, apologetic ghost vanished. The cavalry captain took over. Take those off her, Ainsley ordered, his voice sharp and carrying absolute authority. Gina spun around, her eyes wild, fierce as a cornered wolf. Get out. She is freezing. She's shivering. She is burning alive, Gina. Ainsley dropped his cane. He crossed the room in two long, agonizing strides, ignoring his leg, and began grabbing the heavy woolen blankets, throwing them onto the floor. Don't touch her. Gina struck his shoulder, her fists hitting him with desperate force. Ainsley didn't fight back. He simply absorbed the blows, using his good hand to strip the bed down to a single thin linen sheet. Listen to me, he said, his voice dropping to a low, intense register, locking his eyes onto hers. I buried 50 men with trench fever in Flanders. The camp surgeons taught us. If you smother a fever this high, the brain cooks. You have to let the heat escape. Gina stopped hitting him. She looked down at Clara, whose small chest was rising and falling frantically. The terror in Gina's eyes was total, stripping away every ounce of her hard-won armor. I don't know what to do, she whispered, the confession tearing out of her. It was the first time in 3 years she had admitted defeat. Ainsley's expression softened. He reached out and gripped her upper arms, steadying her trembling frame. I do. We need cold water, and vinegar if you have it in the kitchens. Go. Now. Gina didn't argue. She turned and ran down the dark stairs. When she returned breathless, lugging a heavy iron bucket of well water and a jug of sharp-smelling apple vinegar, Ainsley had already positioned a chair next to the bed. He had unbuttoned the collar of Clara's nightgown to let the air hit her skin. He took the bucket from Gina. Mix the vinegar, equal parts. They worked in silence. The room filled with the sour, sharp scent of the vinegar and the terrifying, ragged sound of the child's breathing. Ainsley dipped a clean linen rag into the icy basin, wrung it out with extreme difficulty, using his right hand and his left palm, and gently laid it across Clara's burning forehead. He then dipped another rag and handed it to Gina. Her wrists and the back of her neck. Keep the blood cool where the veins are close to the skin. For hours, the clock downstairs ticked, measuring out an agonizing eternity. They operated in a desperate, synchronized rhythm. Dip ring apply. When the rags grew warm from the heat of the child's body, they swapped them out. Ainsley didn't sit back. Despite his bad legs screaming from the awkward angle of his chair, he leaned forward, his focus entirely on his daughter. He murmured softly a continuous low rumble of nonsense words, a steady vibration that seemed to anchor Clara's thrashing. Sometime around 4 a.m, the agonizing tension in the room finally snapped. Clara took a deep, long breath. The rattling ceased. The terrifying heat radiating from her skin suddenly broke into a thick, heavy sweat. She turned her head, burying her face into the damp pillow, and fell into a deep, natural sleep. Ainsley slumped back into his chair, his head hitting the stone wall behind him. He let out a long, shuddering exhale. His shirt was soaked with sweat, his face pale and drawn. Gina sat on the edge of the bed. She rested her hand lightly on Clara's chest, feeling the steady, rhythmic heartbeat. She stared down at the damp linen rag in her own hands. The sour smell of vinegar was permanently embedded in her skin. She looked up at Ainsley. The dim light of the dying candle cast deep shadows over his face, highlighting the harsh lines of his exhaustion and the white puckered scars on his neck. "You saved her," Gina said. The words were quiet, but they echoed loudly in the small room. Ainsley kept his eyes closed. He shook his head slowly. "I just cooled the water, Gina. The child fought the battle. I would have smothered her." Her voice hitched a terrifying realization of her own fallibility. I thought I could handle everything. Every rotten beam, every debt. But I panicked." Ainsley finally opened his eyes. He looked at her. Really looked at her. At the dark circles under her eyes, the messy braid, the absolute crushing burden she had carried alone for so long. "You are not a god, Gina," he said softly, his raspy voice gentle. "You are allowed to be afraid when the dark comes." Gina looked down at her lap. A single tear broke free, tracking a hot line down her cheek, falling onto the heavy canvas of her apron. Then another. She didn't sob. She just sat perfectly still as 3 years of held breath of relentless, terrifying independence finally fractured. Ainsley didn't cross the room. He didn't try to pull her into an embrace. He knew he hadn't earned that right. Instead, he reached out his scarred left hand and rested it on the edge of the mattress an inch away from her knee. A silent anchor. "I am a coward," Ainsley whispered into the quiet room, his voice breaking. "I fled this house because I was terrified of failing you. I would rather face French cannons than the look of disappointment I knew I would see in your eyes when the money ran out." He slowly curled his hand into a fist, the missing fingers glaringly obvious in the candlelight. "But I am not running anymore. I will chop the wood. I will cool the water. I will stand in the mud. Whatever you require. I am staying." Gina looked at his ruined hand resting on the mattress. She slowly, hesitantly reached out her own rough, ink-stained fingers. She didn't hold his hand. She merely brushed her knuckles against his. It was a fraction of an inch. But in the freezing, drafty abbey, it felt like the sun cresting the horizon. Spring broke over the valley like a bruised rib tender and weeping. The frost heaves melted into treacherous bogs, and the air smelled heavily of wet manure-crushed pine needles and turning soil. Ink stained the rough calluses of Gina's right hand. She sat at the desk in the steward's office, aggressively crossing out a column of numbers in the main ledger. Her back ached. The damp cold of the stone floor seeped through the soles of her boots, settling into her calves. A shadow fell over the page. Ainsley stood beside her. He didn't hover, and he didn't crowd her space. He simply placed a rolled piece of heavy yellowed parchment on the edge of the desk. He smelled of rain-soaked wool and the harsh, cheap lye soap he used to scrub the horse sweat from his neck. "What is that?" Gina asked, not looking up from her sums. "A topographical map of the Eastern Ridge." Ainsley rasped, pulling out a wooden chair and sitting opposite her. He moved stiffly his ruined thigh, protesting the damp weather. "I found it in the old hunting lodge stores." Gina finally lowered her quill. She looked at the map, then at him. The dark circles under his eyes were less pronounced than they had been in February, and the hollows of his cheeks had filled out slightly courtesy of the heavy root stews. But the permanent tense line of his jaw remained. "We don't hunt anymore, Ainsley," she said flatly. "There is no profit in stag meat compared to the cost of maintaining the hounds. I am not looking for stags," he replied. He unrolled the map with his good hand, using the brass base of an inkwell to weigh down one corner and his mangled left hand to press the other flat. The movement was unselfconscious now. "Look at this road, the one bypassing Oakhaven." Gina leaned forward. The parchment smelled of mildew and old dust. "It's a logging trail. It washes out every April. It washed out because my grandfather refused to let the loggers dredge the adjacent creek, fearing it would ruin his trout fishing." Ainsley traced the faint squiggly line on the map with a scarred finger. "If we send Liam and 3 men from the village to trench the eastern bank for 2 weeks, the road will hold." Gina frowned, her mind immediately calculating wages and time. "Why, the main turnpike gets our grain to the market town just fine. The turnpike charges a toll of 3 shillings per wagon," Ainsley pointed out quietly. "And it takes an extra day of travel. If you trench this logging trail, you cut a day of transport for the spring barley. You bypass the toll. You get to the market town before the Oakhaven farmers, allowing you to set the price rather than react to it." Gina stared at the map. She traced the line he had pointed out. He was right. It was a flanking maneuver, pure military logistics applied to agricultural survival. She looked up at him. "It will cost 20 shillings in wages to trench it," she said, testing him. "You will save 40 on tolls alone by harvest," Ainsley countered instantly. "And the premium on early barley will net another 50. The silence in the small office was different this time. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating silence of resentment. It was the sharp, crackling silence of 2 gears finally catching and turning together. Gina leaned back in her chair. She wiped a stray strand of hair from her forehead, leaving a faint smudge of ink near her temple. "You want to organize the trenching crew. I can direct them." Ainsley said, his voice completely devoid of his old aristocratic arrogance. "I know how to dig a trench that won't collapse. I spent 2 years doing it in the mud of the Low Countries." "Fine," Gina said. She picked up her quill, dipped it in the inkwell, and neatly wrote an authorization in the ledger. "Take Liam. Tell the men they get an extra ration of cider if the mud holds through the first heavy rain." It wasn't a romantic declaration. It was a delegation of authority. But as Ainsley took the map and stood up, his knee popping loudly in the quiet room, a faint, genuine look of relief washed over his scarred face. A week later, Gina stood in the courtyard, her canvas cloak wrapped tight against the biting wind. She was supervising the loading of the first barley wagons. The logging road had held. Ainsley rode in on his gelding entirely caked in mud up to his thighs. He dismounted awkwardly, his breathing heavy, and handed the reins to Liam. He limped over to where Gina was arguing with a grain merchant from the city, a man in a fine velvet coat who was pinching pennies over the weight of the sacks. "The scales are accurate, Mr. Harrison." Gina said, her tone absolute iron. Harrison sneered slightly, his eyes dismissing her raw hands and rough woolen dress. "With respect, Duchess moisture affects the weight. I must deduct 10% for dampness. Perhaps I should speak with the Duke. These matters of commerce are often taxing for a lady." Gina's spine went rigid. Before she could unleash the blistering reprimand building in her throat, a heavy, mud-caked boot stepped beside her. Ainsley didn't yell. He didn't puff out his chest. He stood next to his wife, smelling of earth horse and honest sweat. He looked at the merchant with eyes that had watched men blown apart by artillery, cold flat and completely devoid of patience. "Moi, my wife is the sole authority on the yield of this estate, Mr. Harrison." Ainsley's voice was a low, gravelly rumble that vibrated in the damp air. "If she says the weight is accurate, it is accurate. You will pay the asking price in silver, or you will take your empty wagons back down the toll road and explain to your buyers why you have no barley this month." The merchant swallowed hard, the color draining from his face as he looked at the sheer, terrifying stillness of the scarred veteran. "Of course, Your Grace. I merely meant pay the Duchess." Ainsley interrupted gently. He didn't step in front of her this time. He stood shoulder to shoulder with her, a solid, immovable wall protecting her flank. Gina felt the heat radiating from his muddy coat. She didn't pull away. She held out her hand, and the merchant hastily counted the silver coins into her palm. When the wagons finally rolled out, heading toward the newly trenched logging road, Gina looked down at the heavy pouch of coins. She looked at Ainsley. He was already turning away, checking the gelding's fetlocks for stones. "Ainsley!" she called out over the wind. He paused, looking back over his shoulder. "Dinner is a roasted chicken tonight," Gina said quietly. "Ross managed a trade. There will be hot water in the copper basin by the kitchen fire for your leg before we eat." Ainsley stared at her, the wind whipping his dark, unkempt hair. Slowly, the corner of his mouth twitched upward into a small, ragged smile. "Thank you, Gina." Autumn arrived with a violent display of color, turning the encroaching forest surrounding Westford Abbey into a burning sea of copper and gold. The grand formal dining room of the West Wing was still sealed shut, its crystal chandeliers long traded for winter wool, its delicate chairs burned for firewood during the darkest winter. But the massive stone kitchen hummed with a different kind of life. The hearth fire roared, casting long, dancing shadows across the scrubbed pine floors. Strings of drying garlic, bundles of rosemary, and salted hams hung from the heavy blackened beams. Ainsley sat in the worn wooden armchair near the fire, his bad legs stretched out straight toward the heat. The deep, aching throb in his thigh was a permanent fixture now, but the heat of the fire kept the sharpest claws of the pain at bay. He was holding a piece of coarse sandpaper, smoothing the edges of a small wooden block. Clara sat on the rug between his boots, a sprawling pile of similarly carved wooden blocks scattered around her. She was 4 now, a loud, demanding, and fiercely intelligent creature who ruled the lower half of the abbey with absolute authority. "Tower," Clara demanded, slapping a block onto Ainsley's knee. "You must build a wide base, first little bird." Ainsley murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "If you build it too high without a foundation, the wind knocks it down." He demonstrated using his scarred left hand to steady the blocks while his right hand placed them. Clara watched intently, her gray eyes narrowed in concentration, then mirrored his movements with her tiny, clumsy hands. Gina sat at the heavy pine table behind them. The ledgers were closed for the night. She was repairing the hem of Ainsley's heavy canvas riding coat with a thick bone needle and waxed thread. She paused her stitching and watched them. The man sitting by her fire was not the boy she had married. The boy had been arrogant, flush with inherited pride, terrifyingly fragile under the weight of expectations. The boy had run away. The man sitting there was ruined. He was physically scarred. He limped, he possessed no grand fortune, and he woke up 3 nights a week drenched in cold sweat, fighting ghosts in the dark. But he was solid. When the roof of the northern barn had buckled under the September gales, he hadn't panicked. He had simply grabbed a heavy iron pry bar and stood in the freezing rain for 6 hours, leveraging the beams, while Gina hammered the securing spikes. They had come back to the kitchen covered in mud, exhausted, bleeding, and entirely together. Gina bit off the end of the wax thread and set the coat aside. She stood up, smoothing the front of her woolen skirt. She walked over to the hearth and stopped behind Ainsley's chair. She rested her hands on his shoulders. Ainsley went perfectly still. The sandpaper in his hand stopped moving. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the crackle of the oak logs and Clara humming off key as she stacked her wooden blocks. Slowly, carefully, Ainsley reached up with his right hand and covered Gina's hand where it rested on his collarbone. Her knuckles were rough, the skin dry from lye soap and cold wind. It was the hand of a worker. He pressed his thumb against the ink stain permanently etched into her index finger. "The winter wheat is in," Gina said softly, her voice barely carrying over the fire. "I know," Ainsley replied, leaning his head back slightly against her arm. I checked the silos with Liam this morning. We have enough surplus to last until April, even if it's a hard freeze. We will need to buy more wool for the weavers, she murmured, shifting her weight, her thumb lightly brushing the thick raised scar on his neck. And the eastern perimeter wall needs repointing. I will handle the stonemason from the village, Ainsley said. You terrorized him last time. He prefers dealing with my temper. Gina let out a short, quiet breath that sounded suspiciously like a laugh. He tried to overcharge me for mortar. I know. I'll make sure he doesn't. Ainsley turned his head to look up at her. The harsh orange light of the fire caught the depths of her gray eyes. There was no fairy tale here. There were no silk gowns, no court balls, no grand romantic speeches under the moonlight. Their marriage was built on the smell of rendering fat, the sting of cold mud, the brutal arithmetic of survival, and the slow, agonizing process of learning how to stand shoulder to shoulder in the dark. It wasn't a romance born of luxury. It was a romance born of necessity, forged in the brutal, unforgiving heat of a collapsing world. Papa, look! Clara shouted suddenly, knocking her entire wooden tower over with a joyful shriek. The blocks clattered loudly against the stone hearth. Ainsley smiled, a deep, genuine expression that reached all the way to his tired eyes. He looked back at his daughter. A magnificent collapse, Clara. Now pick them up and we build it again. Stronger this time. Gina squeezed his shoulder gently, stepping around the chair to grab the iron kettle and pour hot water for their evening tea. The Duke of Westford sat by the fire listening to his daughter babble and watching his wife move with precise, undeniable strength through their kitchen. He had left a terrified bride in an empty, decaying castle running from his own hollow reflection. He had returned broken, expecting ruins. Instead, he had found a fortress. And slowly, painfully, block by block, he had finally found a home. If this grounded tale of resilience, flawed characters, and raw romance struck a chord with you, please hit that like button. Sharing this story helps us bring more deeply human and authentic narratives to life stories where love isn't perfect, but it is forged in the mud and the fire. Drop a comment below. What was your favorite moment of Ainsley and Gina's hard-won partnership? Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and ring the notification bell so you never miss a single chapter of our upcoming historical dramas.